Today on the Everything 80s podcast, we're going to look at the top 9 toy playsets from the 1980s. Hey there, what's happening? Welcome back to the Everything 80s podcast. I'm Jamie. Thanks for coming on out today. The toys and action figures of the 80s were amazing. TV hadn't totally rotted our brain yet, so we had some ability to be imaginative and creative with our toys. You would take these action figures outside and create your own little worlds with them. Inside, you would also use whatever objects and items you had to create the ideal toy playsets to further your action figure world building. But with the actual toy playsets put out by the companies, nothing could touch them. They took everything you wanted to make these action figures as playable as possible and put it into the sweetest playset your little mind could imagine. So that's what we're going to look at here today. This is a real nostalgia trip, as I was going through all this, it was tough to put together a top 9. Some of these, I think all of these would have a place somewhere. So, everyone would have a different potential order, but hopefully you'll look back on some of these things very fondly like I did. Before we start, though, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I should be there. And if you're a part of patreon.com, I've got a new movie review coming up in the next week or so. And the only hint I'll give is stay frosty, which probably gives it away right there. But if you want to know more about Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/80s. So patreon.com/80s, or there's a link wherever you're listening to this on. That's just a way to support the show for like a few bucks a month. And then there's different tiers, and with the different tiers come the different rewards, one of them being the Everything 80s Movie Club. So check that out if you're interested. Okay, let's get to these toy play sets. So I'm going to sprinkle in a few audio clips from some of the commercials for them, especially the top 3. I'll do a clip of each one just so you can look back fondly. So as I was saying just in the intro, with these play sets, like we saw the full potential of how the specific toy could be played with, like, most optimally. Also, when you watch the commercials and seeing these kids playing with them, it just sort of, gave you more ideas of what these worlds could become. If you were a creative kid, you didn't need these toy playsets. You could create anything out of, just a sandbox or whatever. And I sometimes think Hasbro regretted with G.I. Joe that they would show kids playing with the toys and action figures in a more natural setting as opposed to having them all set on specific play sets. And I remember doing that in my own yard, digging like little trenches and building mounds and creating these like little war zones that would work perfectly for all the G.I. Joe characters. But the play sets just sort of like perfectly utilized what you could do with specific toys. Just seeing these kids living out your dream in some of these commercials. Some of these play sets, as you'll see when we get to, I had no hope in hell of ever getting. They were too either expensive or lavish or whatnot. So let's start here with number 9. And, I'm sure there's ones that I've left out, and I apologize for that. But at number 9 is from 1987, the Kenner, the Real Ghostbusters Firehouse Headquarters playset. So I recommend going to the show notes for this episode if you want to see more images and some of the commercial clips I've included. So again, wherever you're listening to this, whether it's, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, there'll be a link to take you to the blog version of this whole thing. So I wasn't a massive fan personally of the Ghostbusters toys, mainly because it was a movie I was never allowed to see when it first came out. So I felt like I made it a point to boycott them. The truth is, this Real Ghostbusters Firehouse Headquarters from 1987 is pretty awesome. Hopefully you can picture it. If you're not in the show notes, if you just do a Google image search, just remember, again, even if you didn't like the movie, this was a super fun toy playset. The thing was, it wasn't actually based on the movie, but the cartoon, The Real Ghostbusters. And I think the premise with it is, every kid wants to be a fireman. So this was the perfect way to experience that at home. It had a ghost pursuit fire pole to slide down. It had a ghost containment unit that you could store ghosts in. And coolest of all, if you remember, it had the goop grate. We'll see that concept of a goop grate again. But this playset actually came with a 5-ounce can of that ectoplasm play gel, if you remember. And that was amazing, as usually, and I think from this perspective, these money-hungry toy companies would usually always make you buy these sort of things separately. So the fact that this actually came with this gel goop ectoplasm is pretty incredible. So all in all, a really awesome playset. This one didn't take up a lot of room, and it had the bonus that you could swap out any other figures if you wanted. This wasn't, a prerequisite to just use Ghostbusters figures. You could use anything with it because it was more of this firehouse setting and really cool. Okay, at number 8 is the Hasbro G.I. Joe Headquarters Command Center from 1983. This one looks like this sort of armored fortress thing. And you're obviously going to see G.I. Joe a few times on this list because they really mastered what a toy playset could be. And again, this one goes back quite a ways, 1983, and pretty, rugged, pretty badass fortress playset here. The tagline let us know that this was, quote, fully equipped to fight Destro, Major Blood, and the evil Cobra Commander, unquote. If you go on, I've stumbled across this website as I was putting this together. It's called yojo.com. If you go there, you can see a great breakdown of all the images of this awesome playset. I remember trying to recreate this one. Again, the running theme here is that I did not own a lot of these. And I remember putting one together using wood and popsicle sticks. Very, very specifically can remember this. And needless to say, it sucked. This playset had a ton of really cool features, including machine guns. It had cameras, searchlights. It only cost $24.99, but this was in 1983. So if you convert that for today in inflation, it's around $65, which isn't that bad if you think about it for a playset that's that, pretty epic. But it really did have it all. It had a garage, it had turrets, it had turbines, it had a repair bay. It could also be used with any other brand of action figure because it was such sort of like almost like a standard command center. It didn't necessarily scream that it was G.I. Joe, even though that's what it was made for. So this worked well with a whole bunch of other toys. And this playset seemed like it was in everyone's house. And I remember just getting it as either a hand-me-down or I don't know. It just seemed like one of those toys that everyone had. They had like a beat-up old version of it that their older cousin gave to them. I think that's what I had in that situation. So Kenner is an interesting story. They were a plucky upstart that took a chance on a random robots and aliens movie in 1977 and ended up being a juggernaut in the toy business. I don't know if you know this story. If you're a fan of toys in the 80s, you've probably heard it before. And it's on that Netflix series, The Toys That Made Us, or The Toys That Shape Us, or whatever, the story of Kenner and Star Wars. So everyone, like obviously Star Wars, no one knew what it was going to become, and they were pitched. George Lucas had the foresight to know that merchandising was going to be like the bread and butter of the Star Wars universe if it was going to catch on. In fact, for every dollar that a Star Wars movie has made, they've made $2 in merchandising because of the toys and everything. So he was trying to pitch it even before the movie was released, but everyone was turning it down. And there's stories of him going to specific other companies, and I don't know if they're all myths or not, but people either, being out for lunch and just missing them and whatever. He ended up going to Kenner, and they're like, they don't think this movie is going to be anything special, but they did like the idea of putting out like a modest line of space toys. That was something they were already pursuing. So like, this could be perfect. They'd put out 3 or 4 new characters, and then they would connect them to this new Star Wars movie. You obviously know the rest of the story here, but when Star Wars became a monster hit, Kenner was completely caught with their pants down. They had no one had any idea of the cultural impact of this movie. They had nothing ready to go. They didn't even have anything. Oh, I'm actually recording this. I never even thought of this. I'm recording this on May 4th, Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with you. It's probably going to come out the day after, though. And so Star Wars, though, came out later on in 1977. So they didn't have anything ready to go. They didn't even have anything ready for the next Christmas. That's how far behind they were with this whole thing. And it led to, if you have heard of this, the infamous empty box campaign. And this is where you would buy an empty box with a cardboard display and then send in a voucher to receive the action figures when they were ready. And they dubbed it the early bird certificate package, which sounds like one of the biggest disasters potentially in like consumer kids marketing history, but it actually worked. Kids were obviously so obsessed with this and they wanted any form of toy that they were happy to wait, and everyone still bought them with the promise they were going to get these early figures. There was a set, I think it's like 7, 8, or 9 in that very first release, like the obvious main characters, but there's also a Jawa. There is a Death Star commander, I think. There is Greedo, I think in that original 8. They are worth an obvious fortune. Even those empty boxes, just the cardboard cutouts, if you ever had one of those or it's laying around, they're worth a fortune too. Okay. But let's fast forward to 1983 and then Return of the Jedi, and we met the adorable little Ewoks, which were supposed to be Wookiees in the original script, but they just either couldn't put it together or the budgeting and logistics of having all the costumes and these giant performers was just going to be way too difficult. So with this playset, it was a great sort of departure from the regular space-based toys being on Endor, and it took a playset to more of a natural setting. And the amazing Ewok village depicted in the third and last movie was now something you could take home. Every little kid loved the Ewoks and the idea of being able to like live in that village, very like Robinson Crusoe feel. So it was cool, this thing. It had a working net trap. It had a string rope elevator. It had huts, a campfire. It had a boulder attached to a tree limb to use as a weapon. It was a really solid play set. So solid, in fact, that it was completely ripped off for the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves toy line. So if you remember that movie and then they put out a line of toys, have a look at it. It's the exact same thing as the Ewok Village. All right, let's check out a commercial here for entry number 6.
Alert, alert! Cobra attack! Ready to defy!
It's the G.I. Joe Defiant complex, and it's loaded with firepower.
It's awesome!
The Defiant's launch base opens to reveal a flight control center.
Liftoff! Wow!
The booster becomes a space station, and the Defiant's bay opens for rescue missions.
Imagine flying a Defiant! Go, Joe!
See how real America.
Some assembly required.
Live the adventure of G.I. Joe. Defiant complex comes with driver and astronaut.
Other figures sold separately.
So that is the Hasbro G.I. Joe Defiant Space Shuttle from 1987. This thing is unbelievable. A combination of a toy and a toy playset all rolled into one. It's one that I've never actually seen with my own eyes and was quite a mythological toy. I don't know anyone that owned one, and I think it only existed in our commercial fantasies. I don't know if you've had one or saw one, but it was pretty epic. It was so epic, it has its own Wikipedia page. So this toy is technically made, well, playset or whatever you want to call it, it's technically made up of 3 different vehicles. The first is the crawler unit, which are those enormous rolling machines that transport a space shuttle to a launch site. The second vehicle is the booster unit, which is also like a space vehicle with a crew compartment, computers, and an airlock. Its job is to carry the space shuttle into orbit. Then there is the space shuttle itself. It had different sections, including a cockpit control center, a hatch, and then some other features for use in space, like the umbilical cord to travel around. So this thing was not cheap. It came in at a sweet $129.99 in 1987, or converted for today, nearly $300. I was smart enough not to include anything like this on any birthday or Christmas wish list. That would never happen. It was a popular toy though, and Hasbro had the foresight to release just the Space Shuttle a few years later, making it more affordable, and they renamed it the Crusader. This was a truly epic toy playset that captured everything amazing about G.I. Joe, but again combined it with the excitement of the Space Shuttle program, which was again another mind-blowing thing to kids growing up in the 80s. Okay, for number 5, we're going all the way back to 1978, and that is the Death Star toy. So it's not technically an 80s toy, but it lasted well into the 80s, and it was pretty much adopted by the decade. As mentioned before about Kenner, even though they were caught off guard at first with the success of Star Wars, they eventually did get their act together. This led them to release a pretty cool playset and a very iconic one of, one of the most famous movie creations ever, the Death Star. So again, if you're on the show notes, you have to look this up. It's like a little cross section, like a 3 or 4 floor little chunk out of the Death Star. So it had a bottom level with an elevator shaft, and then that went from top to bottom, and it was over 22 inches tall. It's this vertically designed cross section. I remember this thing just being the coolest thing in the world. My cousin had one. I remember playing with that very well. The top floor even featured 2 different scenes from the movie, which was obviously called Star Wars when it first came out. Then it was dubbed A New Hope in subsequent re-releases. So this got a few sort of weird combinations in it. So either way, this had a lot of amazing detail, not just with those images, but specific rooms for the action figures. And the most amazing feature might have been at the bottom, where it featured the actual working trash compactor. So this is pretty nuts, but I was looking this up on StarWars.com. When that Death Star toy was first released in 1978, it only cost $18. But, even with inflation, it's around $70. So for one of the best toy playsets ever, that's not too bad. That's not over the top. Like, you could reasonably ask for that for like your big main Christmas or birthday gift. Okay, number 4, we are back to G.I. Joe. This is from 1986. It's the G.I. Joe Terrordrome playset from Hasbro. So this was kind of like Hasbro's answer to the Death Star. This one is an interesting playset because it's one that's made specifically for the bad guys, aka Cobra. This can be a risk when putting out a toy, but in the case of G.I. Joe and Hasbro, it worked. To properly play G.I. Joe, you need to have all the parties involved. You can only play with them, like I mentioned, on that mud hill in your backyard for so long. You needed this full experience. You needed the bad guy. You needed Cobra. You needed their lair. G.I. Joe had to go after something. And this was the fortress where Cobra would set up their whole, home base. It had some things like a refueling bay. It had a prison cell, vehicle bays, tower-mounted cannons. It had a launch silo. This was a very interactive playset and one of the few ones that actually came with an action figure. In this set, you received an AVAC pilot to fly the Firebat aircraft. That, of course, was sold separately. When this came out in 1986, it would run you around $59.95 or converted for today, $140. Again, if you happen to have one of these things lying around, it is worth a ton. I don't imagine this is ever the case anywhere. It's why it's so much more valuable, but a box version goes upwards of a few $1,000s. So yeah, have a look in your attic or basement if you have one of those kicking around. So now we're in the top 3. Let's play this first commercial here.
Think up quietly! The foot are about to ambush the turtle's sewer playset. But thanks to the turtle's periscope, it's no surprise. Take cover! The foot are attacking with their sewer ball. Watch out, turtles, or you'll wind up in the recovery room. Oh no! Retro Mutant Ooze! The Shredder's up to his old trick. And speaking of going up, the turtles are taking the elevator to street level to make a call on Shredder using their private line. Reach out and crush someone. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles from Playmates.
So this is the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles sewer play set that was released by Playmates in 1989. Like, I personally, I consider the Ninja Turtles, they are a 90s franchise, but you forget they do have their roots in the 80s, with the comic book coming out in the mid 80s, and then the original cartoon, and then the first few toy lines, and specifically this classic toy playset, The Underground Sewer. One of the greatest ever release, and it completely encompasses everything about the Ninja Turtles. It was super interactive. It didn't seem like a cheap release. This is one we actually had in my house. It wasn't something they were just trying to force to get out there as quick as possible. To a kid, I remember specifically, it looked like it took actual thought. Like there's real design that went into it. It looked like it was made for the most fun possible. The Ninja Turtle figures were a huge hit, obviously, but they always felt like better value because of their more substantial size while still being in that smaller 3.5-inch action figure range. The sewer playset needed to be big enough then to accommodate them, but then not so big that it would put it out of reach financially. The cool part about this playset was that it was a cutaway of an actual city street. You had the sewer down below, but then an actual street above with, telephone poles and fences and everything like that. This is part of the uniqueness and interactiveness of this specific playset by Playmates. It had that periscope through the fire hydrant and then the elevator to take you from street level to subterranean. There was also the sewer grate to throw back from the first one to the Ghostbusters playset, where you could pour ooze through the sewer grate on the unsuspecting victim below. Okay, so we're in the top two, and it was hard to put these in this specific order. I'll explain why. Okay, here's a commercial for entry number 2.
I got it! Wow!
Here it is, the USS Flag aircraft carrier. Imagine being on the deck of this aircraft carrier.
The USS Flag is fantastic! It's so big! Forward now, little Masters! Get ready to launch aircraft! Where's the Admiral? Not here!
G.I.
Fire! Restart Cobra! Yo!
USS Flag aircraft carrier comes with what you see here. Other figures and equipment sold separately.
Joe!
So this is, of course, the Hasbro G.I. Joe USS Flag, the most mythological toy ever created. And technically, whatever you want to call it, a toy, play set, whatever. The largest thing and the most epic toy that would basically make your head explode. This ship toy is the stuff of legend. Again, I never saw one in person. There's a good chance you never saw one in person. I didn't know anyone who owned one, and the closest connection you would get to it was hearing about someone's friend whose neighbor knew someone who owned it, which was probably a bunch of crap anyway. But it didn't matter. This was a toy company creating something to make a kid's head explode. And I did an entire show on this thing. That's how epic this is and how much work and thought and design and everything went into it. So you can go back into the earlier episodes and check it out. But here's a quick breakdown of this massive play set. Again, you can't really call it a toy because you couldn't move it. So that's what makes it a real play set. It measured in at a whopping 7 feet 6 inches long when it came out in 1985. It came with its own public address PA system. It had missile launchers. It had elevator decks. It even came with a fuel delivery vehicle. Hasbro was even nice enough to throw in one action figure. That was Vice Admiral Keelhaul. This thing is so big and solid that it's made up of the same plastic they use for playground equipment. Some of the individual pieces are 2.5 feet long, and there are actual support beams to keep this whole thing supported. It had 9 different trusses and 5 separate deck plates, making it big enough to pretty much display every G.I. Joe action figure and vehicle ever made. Some of the stickers for it were so long that there wasn't enough glue on them to help them keep stuck to the ship. This thing is gigantic is what I'm trying to say. I'm not sure why Hasbro put it out there, as they knew it wouldn't be accessible by the average family, not even just price-wise, but because it wouldn't fit in most rooms. Here's the thing though, it wasn't that crazy expensive. It wasn't cheap, but when it came out in 1985, it cost only $109.99. Convert that for today, it's around $260, which is not that bad of value when you consider the size and scope of this monumental thing. I think this was more for the kid who had every toy, every G.I. Joe toy and vehicle, and it was like a display unit center for it. Still to this day, I put the G.I. Joe USS flag on my Christmas wish list as a joke because as dumb as I was as a kid, I knew better than to ask for it. So it's just this running thing where I continuously, whatever form of wish list, I still put down the US G.I. Joe flag, hoping this year is going to be the year. And if I'd got it as a kid, I might have turned out a completely different person. So, okay. So, that's the ultimate playset toy, but I think you'll see why this one at number 1 is the top playset of the 80s.
What do we have here?
It's Castle Grayskull. And it's mine. Not so fast, Beastman. He-Man!
You can pit He-Man against Beastman, playing for the power of Castle Grayskull. You have to put the castle together.
Beastman's escaping.
The throne, Dad. Dad, you saved the castle.
Castle Grayskull from the Masters of the Universe collection. He-Man and Beastman, each sold separately, from Mattel.
So that's my number 1 from 1982. It's Mattel's Master of the Universe Castle Grayskull. And to me, it's the greatest toy playset because it's the epitome of what a 1980s toy playset is all about. Castle Grayskull wasn't just a functioning interactive playset. It's a character unto itself. I remember I had a broken version of this I got from someone else. I can't remember exactly where, or maybe we got it at a garage sale or something like that. It was beat up and but whatever. It was the closest thing I got to it. What made this thing stand out from all the rest and why I put it in as number 1 was it was like bringing the cartoon home with you. It looked completely lifted from the show. It didn't look like a cheap facsimile or ripoff. With Castle Grayskull, Mattel perfectly captured the essence and iconic image of one of the most significant things from an 80s cartoon. This was amazing because it wasn't just this place that like I said, it was its own character. You could see the skull in the castle's front with a drawbridge entrance that served as its mouth. They beautifully dubbed this the Jawbridge. This, to me, was a real piece of creative work. From there, it was the perfect play set because it was 2 separate parts that joined together with a hinge. So not only could you open it up to play with it, but you could also close it to store everything in it too. So it also worked just as well as a display unit. You also had some amazing features in it, including the throne room, the elevator, and the iconic trap door. When it came out back in 1982, it sold for $26.99. Converted for today, it's around $70, so not too bad. In the cartoon He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, Castle Grayskull is a mythical location, and I really think Hasbro was able to capture the spirit of all this and perfectly put it into what I think is the best toy playset of the 80s and possibly of all time too. So I'll finish it up there. Hopefully you like this. Hopefully I've covered your favorites or ones you maybe forgot about. Maybe you'd have them in a different order, but that's the way I broke it down from my perspective. But again, thank you for taking the time to listen. If you haven't already, subscribe wherever you find your podcast, and I will be back soon with a new episode. Don't you dare miss it.